Your first and very natural reaction to the liar paradox is probably, there shouldn't be sentences like that. There should not be liar sentences. Unfortunately, it is hard to see how one could ban them from existence. Should we make it illegal to include sentences like the one after the star in one's lectures? Anyway, now it has happened. P1 is true, and there is nothing that we can do about it. One can show that there are actually many further reasons why the existence of such self-referential sentences simply has to be acknowledged. For instance, if one does what cryptographers like to do, and what the Austrian mathematical logician Kurt Gödel famously did in the proof of his so-called incompleteness theorems, that is, coding sentences and other linguistic expressions by natural numbers in a way that can be programmed on a computer, then, as Gödel proved, there will always be sentences, in fact infinitely many of them, which in some sense talk about themselves. Their existence follows simply from basic principles of arithmetic. Finally, it is not the case either that self-referentiality just by itself is the problem in the paradox above. Take this sentence, the plus sentence. The sentence in lecture 2 that is introduced by a plus sign consists of 66 signs. If you count the signs of this plus sentence, the sentence that starts with the sentence in ... and which ends with of 66 signs, you will find that it does consist of 66 signs, not counting spaces but counting the full stop at the end. The sentence expresses an empirical truth. The sentence says about itself something that is true. It says this about a sentence, and it just happens that the sentence about which it says this is itself. No contradiction follows from the sentence. Of course not. No contradiction could ever follow logically from a true sentence. So let us simply accept premise 1. If it is not the bad guy, then there is just one other premise to blame, P2, which is an instance of the truth scheme. Does that mean that our definition of truth for L simple is deficient too, since it entails all instances of the truth scheme for sentences in L simple? Not really, fortunately. In our definition from before, we defined the truth predicate true for all the sentences of L simple. But the truth predicate itself was not a member of the vocabulary of L simple. Hence, P2 is not an instance of the truth scheme for L simple. If we had considered a language other than L simple, if we had stated what might have looked like a definition of truth for that language, where the definition would have been materially adequate, where the language would have contained the truth predicate that we were aiming to define, and where the language would also have included a liar sentence, then, by the liar paradox, a contradiction would have followed from this purported definition of truth. Any such definition would not be formally correct then, for consistency is part of what one means by formal correctness. But none of this applies to our definition of truth for L simple. That language did not include the truth predicate that we defined for it. The truth predicate and its definition do not belong to L simple, but to a different language, the language in which we stated our definition of truth for L simple. We find that anyone who is in the business of defining truth is actually dealing with two languages at the same time. The object language, that's the language for which one defines truth, that is, for the sentences of which one defines truth. One defines under what conditions a sentence in the object language is true. And then the meta language, the language in which one defines truth for the object language. For instance, in our toy example from before, L simple was the object language. And a fragment of English, augmented by a couple of mathematical symbols, was the meta language. All the basic expressions and sentences of the object language were also contained in the meta language, but not the other way around. In particular, the truth predicate that we defined for L simple was not itself part of the vocabulary of L simple, nor were all of the terms by which we defined truth for L simple. For instance, the expression for all sets capital Y played a major role in our definition of truth for L simple. But there are no sentences in L simple that contain that expression. More generally, whenever one succeeds in defining truth satisfactorily for an object language in a meta-language in the Tarskian sense of the word, then the meta-language will have to be more expressive than the object language. One can say something in the meta-language, like ascribing truth to whatever sentence of the object language, that the object language itself cannot say. This all goes back to Tarski's work on truth. He had analyzed the liar paradox in detail, and he intentionally set up his example definitions of truth so that any paradoxical conclusions were avoided from the start. For instance, if the truth predicate true is defined for L simple, P2 is simply not an instance of the truth scheme for the object language in question, that is L simple. In fact, P2 is false then. Even granted the existence of the starred sentence on my slides, the left-hand side of P2, the sentence in lecture 2 that is introduced by a star symbol is not true, is not the case, as no sentence involving the truth predicate true is contained in the object language. While the right-hand side of P2, the sentence in lecture 2 that is introduced by a star symbol is not true, that is the case, because the sentence in lecture 2 that is introduced by a star symbol is not true, as it is not even part of the object language. In this way, any disastrous effects of the paradox are avoided. One of the premises of the liar paradox is false, even though it might have looked right initially. One question remains. Say, we accept the existence of liar sentences, and we manage to define the predicate true for an object language in a formally correct and materially adequate Tarskian manner. It follows that the object language does not itself include the predicate true. And the truth equivalence for the liar sentence is not derivable from the definition, which is, of course, good. However, in fact, no sentence whatsoever that includes the defined predicate true is then a member of the object language. For instance, while Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is a sentence of L simple, the sentence Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true is not a sentence of L simple. For that reason, while we can derive Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true if and only if Plato is a teacher of Aristotle from the definition of truth for L simple, we cannot derive the equally plausible Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true if and only if Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true from the definition. It seems that by the same move by which we avoid the truth equivalence for the liar sentence, we also throw away many plausible and unproblematic truth equivalences. Tarski does have a reply to this. Okay, so we've defined true for L simple in a fragment of English plus a couple of formal symbols. Now determine precisely those symbols and grammatical rules that were needed to state that definition of true, including of course the term true itself, and build up a new formal language, say L1, precisely from these symbols and grammatical rules. L1 is a meta-language of L simple, in which we can define the truth predicate true for L simple. Now apply the Tarskian method of constructing a definition of truth again, but this time to the language L1. The truth predicate that we define for this purpose cannot be true again, since that predicate already occurs in L1, so let's use a new predicate, say true 1 instead, which does not occur in L1. The language in which we carry out this definition is a meta-language of L1 and hence a meta-language of the original object language L simple. Call that language L2, and so on. iterate the procedure through L3, L4, and so on and so forth. In this way, Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true if and only if Plato is a teacher of Aristotle. That is derivable from the definition of truth for L simple in the meta-language L1. Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true 1 if and only if Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true. That is derivable from the definition of truth for L1 in the meta-language L2. And then Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true 1, is true 2 if and only if Plato is a teacher of Aristotle is true 1 is derivable from the definition of truth for L2 in the meta-language L3, and so on and so forth. If we start from the language L simple, this is all doable. We can construct such a hierarchy of meta, and so on languages and Tarskian truth definitions on top of it. And the same can be done for much more complex languages than L simple. In this way, the Tarskian method of defining truth does allow us to derive, as it were, reflective truths. Sentences that say something about the truth of, and so on. However, one needs to employ a new truth predicate at each step of reflection. And the more metas are accumulated, the more expressive the corresponding languages become. The more can be said in these languages. While none of these languages is expressive enough to speak about the truth or falsity of all of its own sentences, they can speak about the truth or falsity of all the sentences at the previous stages in the Tarskian hierarchy.